Tonight, let us drift back in time, more than 4 centuries ago, to the quiet forests and winding rivers along the James River in what is now Virginia. The morning mist clung to the trees, and the dew whispered softly through the leaves. In these forests lived the Powhatan people, whose villages were tucked between the rivers, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the land, the seasons, and the creatures that roamed freely across the fields and forests. You may have heard her name before, Pocahontas. Often her story is told as a fairy tale, a romance between two worlds, a moment of heroism that history has exaggerated and polished for centuries. But tonight, we will set aside the myths, the legends, and the stories that grew taller with every telling. Tonight, we will listen to the quiet truth. We will follow the gentle footsteps of a young woman born into a time of great change. A girl who learned the language of the river, who played among the trees, and who carried the weight of her people's hopes and dreams, all while standing on the delicate edge between two very different worlds. So, settle in. Find a comfortable spot. Let your shoulders relax and your mind drift. The sails of the English ships are just on the horizon, barely touching the mist, and the forest seems to hold its breath in anticipation. Close your eyes if you like, and allow the story to carry you softly. Let us begin. With the forests, the river, and the girl we now call Pocahontas. I remember the first time I laid eyes on the James River, though of course it was long before I was born. The river stretched quietly before the small fleet of ships, reflecting the soft early morning light like a ribbon of silver unwinding through the forest. The air smelled of salt and wet wood, with a faint tang of the river mud, damp and earthy. I can almost feel the gentle sway beneath my feet as I step down from the deck of the Susan Constant, my fingers brushing against the rough-hewn ropes and splintered wood of the ship's railing. Everything seemed so vast and alive, and yet there was a stillness, a calm hush that invited you to simply breathe and be present. We had traveled across the endless Atlantic, guided by the sun and stars, each day bringing the subtle creak of the ship and the distant calls of gulls overhead. There was hope in every glance exchanged between the settlers. Some smiled nervously as they looked toward the unknown, while others kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, imagining the land that would become their new home. I remember wondering, quietly, what it might be like to step onto soil that had never felt the tread of English boots, to hear the whispers of trees older than we could ever imagine. Everything seemed simultaneously alive and still, full of possibility and quiet mystery. As we approached the shoreline, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Tall trees with dark, glossy leaves lined the banks, their shadows stretching long over the water. The air was humid and rich with the scent of moss and damp soil. I noticed the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, a sound that was soft enough to almost disappear if you listened too closely. Beneath that calmness, though, there was a sense that the land had its own stories, stories older than any of us, stories that we could feel brushing against the back of our necks as we disembarked, stepping onto the shore, the sand and mud pressed softly beneath our boots. The village was yet to be built, but I could see the beginnings of what would become home, cleared patches of earth, stacks of timber ready to be shaped into shelters, and the faint marks of human hands already at work. There was a quiet rhythm to it all, the slow, deliberate motions of men and women who were both weary and hopeful, their breathing matching the gentle lap of the river against the banks. It was a rhythm that invited contemplation. I wandered among them, taking in the soft sounds of hammers striking wood, the muted chatter of settlers who had traveled so far to arrive here. Their faces bore the traces of sea spray and fatigue, and yet there was something luminous in their eyes, a quiet determination that seemed to pulse gently in the air around them. Some spoke of the fish they had seen leaping in the river, their scales glinting like tiny jewels beneath the sunlight. Others spoke in hushed tones of the forest that stretched endlessly inland, a place of both promise and gentle mystery. It was easy to imagine that the trees themselves were watching us, silently deciding whether we belonged here, whether we would be friends or intruders. I found a quiet spot near the water's edge, where the mud was soft and the reeds swayed lightly with the river's movement. Sitting down, I could hear the faint hum of insects, the occasional splash of a fish, and the soft wind moving through the tall grasses. It was in those moments, so small and serene, that the enormity of what we had undertaken began to sink in. We were here to carve a life from a place that did not yet know our names. We were here to plant not just crops, but stories, dreams, and memories. Even the simplest tasks were infused with a kind of quiet reverence. Gathering wood for the fires, shaping the first walls of our homes, mending nets for the river, each movement carried the weight of care and the promise of survival. I often paused to feel the texture of the timber, rough and yet warm beneath my hands, or the smooth curve of a river stone. Everything had a softness to it if you paid attention, a gentle intimacy that made the hard work feel like part of a slow, unfolding story. By the end of that first week, the settlement began to take shape. Simple wooden frames rose from the earth, the beginnings of houses and workshops. Paths appeared where none had been, worn softly into the soil by careful feet. I would walk these paths slowly, feeling the cool morning dew soak through my shoes, and think about how fragile yet beautiful it all was. There was so much to learn here, so many small details to notice. The way sunlight shifted across the river, the quiet rhythm of birds returning to their nests, the gentle sway of the reeds. Every moment was an invitation to slow down and truly be present, to notice the soft textures of a world in its earliest unfolding, and yet, even in this gentle, hopeful time, I sensed the quiet undercurrent of challenge. There was more to come than the soft sway of the river or the warm touch of morning light. The land was generous in its beauty, but it had its own rules, its own ways of testing those who arrived unprepared. I could feel it in the soil beneath my hands, in the stillness of the forest, in the way the wind seemed to pause before moving through the trees. There was a mystery here, subtle and patient, and I knew, in some quiet corner of my mind, that the story of this place had only just begun. As the sun set and the first stars appeared, I would lie on the soft earth near the riverbank, listening to the quiet lapping of water and the distant call of night birds. I let the gentle darkness wrap around me like a soft blanket, feeling the world slow down to a careful, measured pace. And in that slowing, I realized that there was something magical about simply being present here, in this early, fragile world. The first winter was not yet upon us, but the days had begun to grow shorter, and a quiet chill lingered in the morning air. I remember waking early, the mist still hovering above the river like a thin veil, and noticing how the forest seemed to breathe in silence. Each day carried a rhythm that was both gentle and demanding. We learned slowly, painfully, the ways of this land, how the soil clung to our fingers, how the wind whispered through the trees, and how the river could offer both sustenance and surprise. Life was quieter than I had imagined, but not simpler. The work was endless, clearing new fields, tending small patches of corn, fishing in the river, and caring for one another with small gestures of kindness. Yet beneath these routines, there was a subtle tension, a fragile thread that bound our hope with the uncertainty of the unknown. Some mornings I would watch a settler pause, staring into the distance, as though the forest itself might answer the silent questions we carried. There was something patient and watchful in this land, a quiet. The cold began to ease gradually, and with it came a soft thaw across the settlement. The river flowed more freely, and the forest seemed to stretch and awaken after months of stillness. There was no sudden change, only a gentle easing that carried with it the promise of renewal. Life, which had been measured in small victories and careful steps, slowly began to feel more possible again. Those who remained carried the lessons of the starving time in their faces, in their soft movements, and in the quiet attentiveness of daily life. We had learned that survival was not only about food and shelter, but about noticing, listening, and moving deliberately through a world that had its own rhythms. We tended crops with care, repaired shelters, and fished patiently, learning the subtle ways the land communicated with us. Each success, no matter how small, felt profound. The arrival of supplies from England, barrels of flour and salted meat, was a quiet joy. We did not rush or hoard, but shared carefully, savoring the gentle reassurance they brought. Even these small comforts became lessons in gratitude and patience, and they reminded us that endurance carries its own quiet rewards. The Powhatan people continued to guide us with subtle wisdom. I watched as they showed settlers how to find edible roots beneath frost-hardened ground or locate fresh water in the forest. Their movements were deliberate, graceful, full of understanding, and I began to sense a connection to their knowledge that transcended words. Life in this place required more than labor. It required observation, patience, and gentle humility. Even simple human connections became precious anchors. Sitting quietly by the fire with neighbors, sharing a small meal, listening to soft songs or exchanged stories, each gesture held weight and offered warmth. We found that survival was as much about community, presence, and subtle care as it was about sustaining our bodies. Each glance, each soft word, each careful action, contributed to a shared rhythm that carried us through the cold and scarcity. The river remained our constant companion, reflecting the sky and carrying the subtle currents of the forest along its edges. I spent long hours watching it, imagining the centuries of quiet passage it had seen. Its slow, deliberate flow felt like a teacher, reminding me to observe, to breathe, and to accept the patience required to endure. Gradually, life regained a soft, sustainable rhythm. Crops began to sprout, small shoots pushing up through thawing earth. Animals cautiously emerged from the forest. We learned to move with awareness, respecting the cycles of growth, the whispers of the wind, and the quiet intelligence of the land. Even in the midst of challenge, there was beauty and quiet order to be found. I would walk alone through the forest, listening to the wind in the trees, the trickle of thawing streams, the soft calls of returning birds. Sunlight filtered through branches, illuminating moss and leaves in delicate patterns. These small, attentive moments taught patience, humility, and awareness, and they reminded me that survival is never only about endurance. It is about learning to live gently and deliberately in a world that moves at its own pace. Even as we recovered, there was a quiet reverence for the lessons of hardship. We had endured, yes, but we had also grown in our ability to observe, to move carefully, and to notice the subtle gifts of the land. The starving time had left its mark, yet it had also shaped a gentle resilience. A calm attentiveness that would carry us forward into each day with awareness, care, and patience. As the first green shoots appeared, and the ice melted along the riverbanks, I sat quietly by the water once more. I felt the weight of months gone by and the soft promise of months to come. Life had returned, slowly, deliberately, and with it came an understanding. The story of Jamestown was about presence, observation, and quiet endurance, not only survival. We had learned to move with the land, to notice the subtle beauty in small moments, and to treasure the gentle rhythms of life. And so, with evening falling softly over the settlement, painting the sky in muted shades of rose and gold, I let myself rest in the hush of the land. The river whispered, the forest held its secrets, and we, fragile yet enduring, had discovered the quiet power of patience, reflection, and presence in this fragile, beautiful new world. As the last light of day faded over the James River, I sat quietly on the soft, worn earth, listening to the gentle rhythm of the water as it flowed past the settlement. The forest stood in patient stillness, its trees tall and watchful, as though keeping silent guardianship over all we had built here. There was a softness in the air, a quiet lull that wrapped the land in gentle calm, and I breathed slowly, letting the events of the past month settle into quiet memory. I thought of the settlers who had come before, and those who would follow, imagining their soft footsteps along the riverbank, the rustle of leaves under careful feet, the whisper of wind through the trees. Life here had been hard. Yes, but it had also been full of subtle beauty, sunlight glimmering on thawing water, tender shoots breaking through frozen soil, the distant song of a bird returning to the forest. These small details, often easy to overlook, were the essence of our story, a story of quiet patience, gentle endurance, and the slow unfolding of life even in the face of difficulty. The river continued its soft journey, carrying the reflection of clouds and sky in delicate ripples. I watched the settlers move slowly through the clearing, their gestures careful, deliberate, as if in silent conversation with the land itself. And I realized that the story of Jamestown was not only about survival, or hunger, or hardship, but about learning to live attentively, to observe, to notice the quiet gifts around us, and to move with patience and care. As night deepened, the sky painted itself in rich, muted shades of blue, dotted with the first faint stars. I felt the gentle presence of history all around me, the centuries of rivers flowing, forests watching, and human footsteps leaving soft impressions on the earth. I let my thoughts drift, like leaves floating along the water, carried by the soft rhythm of the river, and I felt a quiet sense of connection, of being part of something larger than myself. And now, as you listen, I invite you to rest with the same calm awareness. Let your mind drift gently, carried by the quiet currents of the river, the subtle whisper of the forest, and the soft, enduring rhythm of life. The settlers of Jamestown learned, slowly, that survival is more than strength, it is patience, presence, and gentle care. And in that truth, there is peace, so close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the quiet world of Jamestown carry you gently towards sleep. Life endures, even in hardship, with subtle beauty and quiet rhythm all around. Let your mind rest, soft and still, as the river flows, the forest breathes, and history whispers its gentle, timeless story. As the last light of day faded over the James River, I sat quietly on the soft, worn earth, listening to the gentle rhythm of the water as it flowed past the settlement. The forest stood in patient stillness, its trees tall and watchful, as though keeping silent guardianship over all we had built here. There was a softness in the air, a quiet lull that wrapped the land in gentle calm, and I breathed slowly, letting the events of the past month settle into quiet memory. I thought of the settlers who had come before, and those who would follow, imagining their soft footsteps along the riverbank, the rustle of leaves under careful feet, the whisper of wind through the trees. Life here had been hard. Yes, but it had also been full of subtle beauty, sunlight glimmering on thawing water, tender shoots breaking through frozen soil, the distant song of a bird returning to the forest. These small details, often easy to overlook, were the essence of our story, a story of quiet patience, gentle endurance, and the slow unfolding of life even in the face of difficulty. The river continued its soft journey, carrying the reflection of clouds and sky in delicate ripples. I watched the settlers move slowly through the clearing, their gestures careful, deliberate, as if in silent conversation with the land itself. And I realized that the story of Jamestown was not only about survival, or hunger, or hardship, but about learning to live attentively, to observe, to notice the quiet gifts around us, and to move with patience and care. As night deepened, the sky painted itself in rich, muted shades of blue, dotted with the first faint stars. I felt the gentle presence of history all around me, the centuries of rivers flowing, forests watching, and human footsteps leaving soft impressions on the earth. I let my thoughts drift, like leaves floating along the water, carried by the soft rhythm of the river, and I felt a quiet sense of connection, of being part of something larger than myself. And now, as you listen, I invite you to rest with the same calm awareness. Let your mind drift gently, carried by the quiet currents of the river, the subtle whisper of the forest, and the soft, enduring rhythm of life. The settlers of Jamestown learned, slowly, that survival is more than strength, it is patience, presence, and gentle care. And in that truth, there is peace. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the quiet world of Jamestown carry you gently towards sleep. Life endures, even in hardship, with subtle beauty and quiet rhythm all around. Let your mind rest, soft and still, as the river flows, the forest breathes, and history whispers its gentle, timeless story.